Penguin Random House Audio presents The Story, A Reporter's Journey. This is the author, Judith Miller. For friends, fellow journalists killed while telling the story: Dial Torgeson, David Blundy, Daniel Pearl, Marie Colvin. And for Bill Sapphire, word warrior, who encouraged me to keep trying. Prologue. I thought I was doing well. In the spring of 2002, a year before the invasion of Iraq, I was at the peak of my profession. A member of an investigative unit at the New York Times, America's most prestigious newspaper. I had been part of a small team that had just won a Pulitzer for our investigation before 9/11 into al-Qaeda and its growing threat to America. I had also received an Emmy that year for a documentary based on germs, a book I had written with Stephen Engelberg and William Broad, two respected Times colleagues. I had finally been lucky in love. For the past 9 years, I'd been married to a brilliant publisher, a legend in his own profession, who was proud of my work and tolerated my frequent lengthy assignments, often to dangerous places, especially in the Middle East, where I'd been the paper's Cairo bureau chief for several years. I could not have imagined that 3 years later my reporting would be mired in controversy, or that some of my lifelong assumptions about politics, foreign policy, and journalism would be tested and shattered. At the start of the Iraq War in 2003, I was sent to cover it as the only reporter embedded in a secret army unit charged with finding the weapons of mass destruction that the Central Intelligence Agency and other intelligence agencies concluded Saddam Hussein was hiding. Before and during the war, it was my job to report in the most timely way on what the U.S. government believed to be true. It sounds easy. In the hyper-secretive world of national security, it isn't. The CIA and other intelligence agencies were convinced with high confidence that Saddam had chemical and germ weapons programs and was actively seeking a nuclear bomb. I got scoops about some of that intelligence. I hedged the assertions with all the proper qualifiers. Eventually, over the course of America's long occupation of Iraq, more than 6,000 chemical weapons or remnants of them, some containing mustard gas and sarin made before the 1991 war, were found and tragically sickened some American soldiers and Iraqis. While the Times and other news outlets claimed that these were not the weapons for which America had invaded, Saddam's failure to acknowledge or account for them violated his pledges to the United Nations and was part of the administration's justification for war. But the central, clearly newsworthy claim of some of my pre-war stories was wrong. As we now know, Saddam did not have an active program to create and use WMD or stockpiles of such new, sophisticated weapons. The faulty intelligence on which the decisions of policymakers and politicians were based was used to justify a war whose consequences have thus far proven disastrous for the Iraqi people and America. As the war began to go badly, controversy erupted not only over the government's missteps, but also the media's role in publicizing the government's estimates, and my reporting in particular. From a journalist whose boss, Bill Keller, once described as smart, relentless, incredibly well-sourced, and fearless, I was suddenly being characterized as a pushy woman reporter who would do anything for a scoop, a warmonger who had helped sell and carry out the war. A campaign against my reporting had been launched in the blogosphere by critics, some of whom have no idea what reporting involves. I sensed that they were reacting to the ill-fated war, but the false characterization still stung. I often didn't know whether to laugh or cry. I did a bit of both. Accusations that I was a closet neocon or the most gullible reporter the Times had ever hired quickly migrated from internet columns to ideologically linked journals, then to the so-called mainstream media, and soon reverberated throughout the global electronic universe. The accusations popped up in books by celebrated pundits, almost none of whom called me for comment, in scholarly works on journalistic ethics, and even in a book on irresponsible work by a Harvard professor. On WMD in Iraq, I had lots of company in government and the media. In hindsight, few of the officials whose decisions prompted the mess in Iraq understood what they were getting into, not those in 1991 who favored leaving Saddam in power, or those in 2003 who sought to bring democracy to Iraq by force. Wrong, too, were those who argued in 2007, as the war was failing, that switching strategies and a surge of forces in Iraq would not affect America's military fortunes there. So were those who claimed that America had finally won in Iraq, and those in 2010 who advocated pulling our troops out post-haste. There's no shortage of mistakes about Iraq. Good grace and honesty require all of us who made them to admit error. This book is part of that process. Over time, questions about the rightness of the Iraq War, both in conception and outcome, morphed in some quarters into a broad condemnation of the media and accusations that the press, not the government, had taken the country to war. The charge was both untrue and toxic to our political discourse. But with newspapers under increasing economic pressure, the charges of warmongering felt like mortal threats to an institution and a profession to which I had devoted my life. It was into this landscape that a federal investigation was launched to determine who had leaked the name of a CIA agent whose husband had accused the White House of having lied about Iraq's WMD. I received a federal subpoena demanding that I disclose the identity of sources who may have blown the agent's cover. I went to jail to protect those sources, or so I thought. When the officials and weapons experts finally determined that there were no WMD stockpiles and active programs to make them to be found in Iraq, I was shocked and angry. But I thought I knew why the CIA and other intelligence agencies made some of their mistaken assumptions and reached the wrong conclusions. I believed it was my responsibility to report this. The Times did not permit me to do so, and soon after I got out of jail, I felt I had no choice but to resign. For years afterwards, friends urged me to write about this tumultuous period. I hesitated. The entire episode was still too painful and confusing. But eventually I concluded that I had to try. When journalists make mistakes about an event or a person, we must revisit our work to report new contradictory information or fill in the contours or holes in an incomplete story. I wrote this book because I believe that the forces that played substantial roles in my personal experience, a government that aggressively hides the truth from the public and prosecutes reporters, the collapse of the flawed but still invaluable temples of 20th century American journalism, and the very real threats that emanate from a part of the world that understandably frightens and exhausts us, are continuing to drive the deeply troubling decline in the quality of information available to both policymakers and the public. I take tremendous pride in being good at my job. Correcting and completing the record are part of the pact that journalists make with readers. The book is my effort, finally, to fulfill the last of my end of that bargain. The Story. Chapter 1. Anbar Province, Iraq. Late July, 2010. As I opened the door of my flimsy CHU, the compartmentalized housing unit at Camp Ramadi in the Iraqi desert, where I had slept after arriving from Baghdad, a gust of wind covered me with sand. The thermometer on the trailer door registered 100. It was 6 a.m. "Welcome to Spa Ramadi," Major Ryan Cutchin said. Tall, sandy-haired, and army fit, Ryan loved mornings. 20 years a soldier.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?